Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why military strategists, intelligence analysts, and Pentagon planners are asking a question that, 5 years ago, seemed unthinkable. A question that doesn't appear in the news, that isn't debated in major foreign policy forums, but that is silently redefining the global balance of power. Right now, somewhere in the South China Sea, a navigation systems operator aboard a U.S. destroyer is looking at a monitor showing coordinates that make no sense. The indicated position is wrong, not because of a technical failure of American equipment, not because of a solar storm, not because of a software glitch, but because someone 300 miles above their head is transmitting a different signal from a different constellation, and their precision weapons systems are listening to that signal and obeying. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a simulation exercise. GPS spoofing incidents in military operation zones are documented, measured, and increasing. The question this video will answer isn't, has GPS stopped working? That's the wrong question. The right question is different. Has GPS ceased to be the planet's exclusive coordinate system? And what does that mean for those who built their military, financial, and geopolitical power on the premise that this monopoly was permanent? Because what Russia and China have built together isn't just a technical alternative to American GPS. It's the first adversarial global navigation architecture in history, and it went operational before the United States even realized what was being built around them. Not a missile, not a drone, a coordinate. Today, you'll understand how the Chinese Beidou and the Russian GLONASS merged into a single operating system. You'll understand what an interoperability agreement signed in 2023 really means in strategic terms. You'll understand why the American response, the GPS M-code update, is years behind the threat it needs to face. And you'll understand why the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is silently transforming into a GPS immunity bloc. But before we get to all that, you need to understand something fundamental that most people don't realize. GPS was never just a navigation system. GPS is a power infrastructure. And when you understand that, the whole story changes. Think of the petrodollar. For decades, the fact that oil was denominated in US dollars wasn't just a financial convention. It was a mechanism of coercion. Whoever needed energy needed dollars. Whoever needed dollars needed the American financial system. And whoever needed the American financial system was, by definition, exposed to American influence. GPS worked in exactly the same way, only in the physical domain. When the United States opened civilian access to GPS in 1996, they weren't being generous. They were making the whole world depend on their infrastructure. Every smartphone that uses navigation, every container crossing the Pacific tracked by AIS, every financial market operation that needs a timestamp for validation, every precision missile an American ally launches on a battlefield. All of this depends on signals transmitted by 31 American satellites at an altitude of 20,000 kilometers. This dependency wasn't accidental. It was strategic. If you control the world's coordinate system, you control the cost of operating outside of it. Adversaries who build their military capabilities on top of GPS are, by definition, vulnerable to an American decision to degrade or deny that signal in a conflict. And allies who depend on GPS to function have a structural incentive to maintain alignment with Washington. GPS was, in other words, the petrodollar of navigation, an infrastructure choke point that turned technical dependence into geopolitical leverage. The question Pentagon planners had been asking silently for years is, when did this monopoly end? And who was it that ended it? To understand what was destroyed, you need to understand what was built. The Navstar program, which would give rise to GPS, began in 1973 as a strictly military project. The idea was simple: launch satellites into high enough orbit to cover the entire planet, transmit highly accurate time signals, and use the difference in arrival times of those signals to calculate a position with meter-level precision. The first real test at scale came in the Gulf War in 1991. For the first time in modern military history, infantry units navigated the Iraqi desert with handheld GPS receivers. Guided bombs found targets with a precision that, a generation earlier, would have required hundreds of missions and accepted enormous collateral damage. GPS didn't just win the war, it redefined what precision warfare means. In 1996, President Clinton signed the directive that opened the civilian GPS signal without the artificial degradation called selective availability. Overnight, GPS became accessible to anyone with a receiver. What followed was the largest transfer of dual-use infrastructure in history. The whole world began building critical systems on top of American signals. The implications were profound and, at first, virtually invisible. The AIS Maritime Tracking System, which identifies the positions of tens of thousands of ships in real time, relies on GPS. The Commercial Aircraft Navigation System that enables automatic landings in zero visibility conditions relies on GPS. The timestamps that validate trillions of dollars in financial transactions within the SWIFT system depend on GPS signals for synchronization accuracy. The coordination of electrical power grids that supply entire cities depends on GPS. By 2024, GPS was embedded in more than 7 billion devices in use worldwide, not as an auxiliary feature, as core infrastructure. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the Soviet Union had tried to build its own equivalent even before GPS reached maturity. GLONASS, Global Navigation Satellite System, was conceived as the Soviet answer to Navstar. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the system collapsed along with it. By 2001, GLONASS was operating with only 6 satellites. It wasn't a global system. It was a fragment of an ambition that had evaporated along with the Soviet Union. And the United States, looking at this scenario, concluded what any rational analyst would conclude from the available data. No adversary had the resources, the technology, or the political resolve to build a global navigation constellation from scratch. GPS was the permanent standard. The monopoly was secure. This conclusion was wrong in 2 fundamental ways, and the mistake will prove costly. First, because Russia hadn't abandoned GLONASS. It was rebuilding it under Putin as a matter of national security urgency. Second, because China wasn't trying to compete with GPS. It was building a replacement that would make competition irrelevant. Beidou wasn't born as a scientific project. It was born as a strategic decision following a humiliating lesson. In 1993, during a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, a Chinese cargo ship was stopped in the Red Sea on suspicion of carrying components for the Iranian weapons program. The United States requested the ship's position data. The existing chain for providing this data went through American GPS. For Chinese leaders, the lesson was immediate and lasting. Relying on American GPS for military navigation was equivalent to giving the adversary a built-in kill switch for their most critical systems. It was an unacceptable strategic vulnerability for a power planning to project power in the 21st century. The Beidou program was approved in 1994. Phase 1, regional coverage with experimental satellites, was completed between 2000 and 2003. Phase 2 expanded coverage to the Asia-Pacific region between 2004 and 2012. And Phase 3, the most ambitious and decisive, took Beidou from regional to full global coverage, declared operational in July 2020. Today, Beidou operates with over 35 active satellites distributed across multiple orbits. Civilian accuracy is approximately 2.5 meters, directly comparable to GPS. Military accuracy with encrypted signals reaches less than 1 meter. In terms of coverage and technical capability, Beidou is not inferior to GPS. In the Asia-Pacific and Middle East regions, it is superior. More satellites, better geometry, and higher density. But what makes Beidou fundamentally different from GPS isn't technical precision. It's the architectural choices that China deliberately made. Beidou utilizes 3 different types of orbits: geostationary satellites at high altitude for broad coverage and signal stability, inclined geosynchronous orbit satellites for greater regional density, and medium Earth orbit satellites for truly global coverage. This combination creates a level of redundancy that a single orbit system cannot offer. More important than the technical architecture, China made the use of Beidou mandatory. By government decree, all critical Chinese infrastructure, power grids, financial systems, telecommunications networks, military forces, defense systems migrated to Beidou. GPS was removed from the systems that matter. This wasn't a recommendation. It was an order. And then came the export strategy that transformed Beidou from a national project into a geopolitical one. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project in modern history, China installed Beidou receivers in more than 120 countries. Ports, railways, power grids, communication systems, pipelines. Wherever China built, Beidou went along, embedded in the hardware as a standard component. Today, hundreds of millions of devices around the world already operate on Beidou without their users, or in many cases, their governments, necessarily noticing or caring. Beidou alone already represented a threat to the premise of the American monopoly. But there was a technical limitation that military planners were aware of. A national constellation, even with global coverage, is still a single manageable point of failure, a single signal, identifiable frequencies, vulnerable to a sufficiently coordinated and persistent jamming campaign. The strategic question was, what if someone removed that point of failure? In 2001, GLONASS had only 6 operational satellites. It didn't even cover the whole of Russia reliably. It was a strategic embarrassment for a country that considered itself a space superpower with decades of history in its space program. Putin understood this as a matter of strategic survival, not national prestige. In 2001, he signed a decree making the restoration of GLONASS to full capacity an absolute state priority. Funding was guaranteed. Launches were accelerated. The program was protected from budget cuts. By 2011, GLONASS was back to full operational capacity, with 24 satellites covering the globe. The Russian mandate was explicit and non-negotiable. All critical national infrastructure, all military systems, and all government communication networks must use GLONASS as their primary system. GPS was allowed as a secondary redundancy, not as a strategic dependency. 2 countries, 2 constellations, 2 parallel and independent processes to eliminate vulnerability to American GPS. And then came 2023, and with it, something that transformed 2 parallel lines into a single architecture. The Beidou GLONASS interoperability agreement signed in 2023 wasn't widely covered by the Western press. There was no global press conference, no dramatic statement that caught the attention of major news outlets. But what that agreement represents in strategic terms is as significant as any military alliance signed in the last 30 years. The agreement established signal-level compatibility between the 2 systems. What this means in practice is precise. A single receiver can now simultaneously capture and process signals from both Beidou and GLONASS. Not 2 separate receivers installed in parallel. A single device receiving data from over 60 satellites at once, compared to GPS's 31. Think about what this arithmetic represents. Positioning geometry improves dramatically with more satellites visible simultaneously. Geographic redundancy is incomparable, even in highly contested environments. There will always be enough satellites with good geometry above the horizon. And the militarily critical point, to interfere with this fused system, you would need to simultaneously disrupt the frequencies of both Beidou and GLONASS independent systems, operated by different countries, with control infrastructure in territories separated geographically by thousands of miles. 2 independent systems are exponentially harder to jam than 1. This is the true meaning of what this video calls a joint satellite swarm. It's not a constellation co-launched by joint missions. It's not a unified system managed by a single ground control team. It's something architecturally more sophisticated. 2 independent systems made operationally interchangeable so that any user with the right receiver can access both as if they were a single coherent system, not 2 constellations. 1 architecture. Let's put some hard numbers into this equation, because when you look at the coverage arithmetic, the strategic shift becomes impossible to ignore or minimize. GPS, 31 active satellites in 6 orbits, global coverage. Beidou, more than 35 active satellites, global coverage with increased density specifically in the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East. GLONASS, 24 satellites, global coverage with density in the Northern Hemisphere. Combined with the interoperability agreement, over 90 satellites potentially accessible to a multi-constellation receiver, compared to GPS's 31. In satellite navigation, precision depends on a concept called geometric dilution of precision, GDOP. The more satellites with good angular distribution you can see simultaneously, the more accurate your calculated position. With 31 satellites, GPS offers adequate global coverage. With 90 accessible satellites, precision improves in any environment, especially in urban environments with obstructions, mountainous terrain, or scenarios where part of the horizon is blocked by combat geometry. For military purposes, this isn't a technical detail. It's a concrete operational advantage. But the most militarily critical point isn't the added precision. It's the resistance to interference. GPS transmits on known and documented frequencies, L1 at 1,000, 575.42 MHz, L2 at 1,000, 227.60 MHz. An effective jamming system only needs to cover these frequencies with enough noise to degrade the signal below the threshold of use. In contested theaters of operation, GPS has been routinely degraded by adversaries with electronic warfare capabilities. The number of documented incidents is concrete and growing. In the Black Sea, since 2019, AIS anomalies attributed to GNSS spoofing have been systematically recorded by maritime security agencies. In 2024, more than 1,000 documented civil aviation spoofing events were recorded in zones near conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. In the Ukrainian conflict zone, military GPS systems suffered documented degradation from Russian electronic warfare operations. Over Syria, American drones experienced navigation anomalies consistent with positioning interference operations. Now consider what an adversary would need to do to replicate that result against a multi-constellation Beidou GLONASS receiver. He would need to simultaneously jam Beidou frequencies, which are distinct from GPS. Jam GLONASS frequencies also distinct, and do this in a coordinated, persistent manner, covering an area large enough to degrade the calculated position below the operational limit. 3 independent frequency systems, 2 separate command and control chains in different territories. The saturation arithmetic that works against GPS doesn't apply back to the fused system with the same effectiveness. What works against one system doesn't work the same way against 3, and this understanding isn't theoretical for American adversaries. Russian and Chinese military equipment is already multi-constellation as a factory standard. The hardware exists, the receivers are in the field. Doctrine is being developed based on real operational experience, not simulations. There is a question that analysts rarely ask about Beidou and GLONASS, but it's the most strategically important. Who is adopting these systems, and what does this adoption mean for American leverage? Let's start with the cases of total adoption, which are the most revealing. China has removed GPS from all national critical infrastructure. Financial systems, energy grids, military communications, defense systems. They all operate on Beidou as the primary system. GPS has no access to the structures that matter in China. This means any American threat to degrade or deny GPS access as an instrument of geopolitical coercion simply has no effect on critical Chinese capabilities. Russia did the same with GLONASS. By presidential decree, the primary system for all Russian critical infrastructure is GLONASS. GPS is tolerated as a redundancy, but it is not the backbone of anything strategically relevant. The vulnerability was eliminated by decree. Iran, whose military systems have been documented with integrated Beidou receivers through technological cooperation agreements with China, operates in an environment where dependence on American GPS would be a fatal and obvious vulnerability. The Iranian migration to Beidou is a documented process, not speculation. India is the most complex and strategically revealing case in the equation. India has developed its own regional navigation system, NAVIC, with coverage over the Indian subcontinent. At the same time, technical compatibility with Beidou exists. The Indian position is one of calculated strategic ambiguity. Neither full dependence on American GPS nor alignment with the Sino-Russian bloc, a third path that preserves geopolitical flexibility. But it is in the member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization where the true scale of adoption becomes quantitatively visible. The SCO, with members including Russia, China, Iran, India, Pakistan, and multiple Central Asian states, has documented navigation integration discussions since at least 2024. Through the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan, Central Asia, and the Middle East, Beidou receivers have been installed in logistical networks, energy grids, and telecommunications as a standard component of Beijing-funded projects. When a country installs Beidou in its energy systems, ports, and communication networks, something strategically significant happens that has no easy way back. The American threat to degrade GPS as an instrument of pressure stops working against that country. You cannot coerce someone using an infrastructure they no longer depend on as leverage. This is the collective GPS immunity program. The countries building exits from GPS are exactly the countries the United States would need to coerce in a high-intensity conflict. And as each of them migrates to Beidou GLONASS as their primary infrastructure, the American instrument of coercion loses operational value irreversibly. The dynamic is identical to the de-dollarization of the global economy. The power of the dollar doesn't derive from its domestic use, but from the global obligation to use it to buy energy. As powers eject the dollar from their transactions through alternative payment systems and bilateral agreements, Washington's financial siege loses strength. The SCO bloc is applying the exact same playbook against GPS. They are disarming the American choke point in the domain of coordinates, not currencies. Let's return to the American operator with whom we began this video. Because now, you have the complete architecture. And the real question can be asked with precision. What does the strategic obsolescence of GPS concretely mean for American military capability? American dependence on GPS is not peripheral. It is structural and profound. JDAM's low-cost guided bombs that transformed the American Air Force into a surgical precision machine starting in the 1990s depend on GPS for terminal guidance. Tomahawk missiles, the backbone of American long-range strike power for over 3 decades, use GPS as a central component for cruise navigation. Drone swarms, which have become the extreme cost-effectiveness weapon for high-impact operations, depend on GPS for precise coordination and autonomous guidance. Military analysts document that approximately 90% of the precision-guided munitions in the American arsenal depend on GPS as the primary guidance system. This isn't a vulnerability of secondary systems. It is the nerve center of American force projection capability, the advantage that justifies decades of investment in precision munitions versus low-cost volumetric arsenals. Go beyond individual missiles. A carrier strike group, the most expensive and technologically sophisticated unit of combat power ever operated by any military force, relies on GPS synchronization for multi-domain force coordination. When multiple surface ships, carrier-based aircraft, supporting submarines, and distributed weapons systems need to operate in high-speed coordination across a broad theater of operations, GPS provides the common clock and map that make this coordination possible. Degrading GPS in a strike group's operational environment doesn't destroy the fleet, but it dramatically increases the risk of coordination errors, collisions, and guided munitions arriving off target. And there is a dimension to the problem that is rarely discussed publicly: American civilian dependence on GPS as an indirect military vulnerability. The American financial system, which processes trillions of dollars in daily transactions across multiple platforms, uses GPS timestamps for validating and sequencing operations. The American power grid uses GPS synchronization for coordination between power plants and distributors. The world's busiest civil aviation system uses GPS as a central navigation component. None of these systems were designed with robust tolerance for prolonged GPS degradation, because for 30 years, GPS degradation was treated as an implausible scenario that didn't require contingency planning. Adversaries have eliminated their own vulnerability to GPS, while American vulnerability remains structurally intact. The American response to this problem has a specific name: M-code. M-code is an update to the military GPS signal, more resistant to jamming by using higher directional transmission power, harder to spoof through advanced encryption, and capable of operating in interference environments where the civilian GPS signal would be completely useless. It's a real and significant technical advancement. The first satellites with full M-code capability are in orbit. But there are two fundamental problems that make M-code an insufficient response to the actual strategic problem. First, the timeline. Full deployment of the GPS constellation with complete M-code capability across all satellites is scheduled for approximately 2027. This means there is a window of vulnerability right now, in 2026, where American resistance to jamming is partial and unevenly distributed across the arsenal. M-code receivers are not uniformly installed across all platforms and munitions. The transition is underway, but not complete, and windows of vulnerability are exactly what sophisticated adversaries exploit. Second, and more fundamentally, M-code solves the military technical vulnerability. It does not solve the vulnerability of civilian infrastructure. It does not solve the vulnerability of American allies who operate with standard GPS equipment. And most importantly, it doesn't solve the core geopolitical problem that adversaries have already built a robust alternative system to which their partners and SCO states are actively and irreversibly migrating. M-code is a response to the problem of 2015. The problem of 2026 is architecturally different. The problem of 2026 isn't that GPS can be taken down. It's that it can be ignored. Go back to the question this video started with. Not the technical question about satellites or frequencies or positioning algorithms. The real strategic question. What does it take to make a global infrastructure system obsolete as an instrument of power without physically shutting it down? The answer is here, in the architecture you just understood. Not a missile. Not a drone. A coordinate. What Russia and China have built together isn't a weapons system in the conventional sense. It's an alternative infrastructure that makes GPS dependency optional for any country that chooses to adopt it. And by making that dependency optional, they've made the instrument of coercion that GPS represented ineffective. This is the consolidation of the navigation yuan. The petrodollar monopoly wasn't toppled by a treaty, but by the gradual creation of financial escape routes that turned dependency into a choice. Beidou plays exactly this role in space. By providing a positioning infrastructure immune to sanctions and blockades, it reduces any country's exposure to Washington's geopolitical coercion. GPS isn't going to disappear, just as the dollar hasn't disappeared. But its power as an inescapable choke point has been broken. The power transition has already begun, with the same logic, with the same irreversibility. GPS continues to work. It continues to be accurate. It continues to be used by billions of people and by systems that matter. But its function as the planet's coordinate monopolist, as the only system upon which critical infrastructure, precision weapons, and global military operations must be built, that function is being systematically eroded. And this erosion is not reversible in the short or medium term. Once a country's critical infrastructure is built on Beidou receivers, switching back to GPS exclusive requires a nationwide hardware replacement that takes decades and costs hundreds of billions of dollars. The trilateral alignment that is consolidating, Russia with GLONASS, China with Beidou, and SCO members gradually joining the fused architecture, creates a block where American leverage via GPS simply has no operational foothold. The 2023 Interoperability Agreement was the moment when the alternative architecture became robust enough to be irreversible. Navigation's petrodollar has met its yuan, and this time that yuan is orbiting 300 miles above our heads. So, what should we look for in the coming weeks and months as indicators of how this story is unfolding? First, the Beidou Phase 4 launches. China has announced a further expansion of the constellation with new satellites specifically aimed at increasing the system's density and resilience. Every successful launch confirms that the system's path toward maturity and hardening is continuing at a breakneck pace. Second, the navigation integration agreements within the SCO. When member states formalize the use of Beidou GLONASS in their vital state systems through bilateral or multilateral treaties, it's not just technical cooperation between bureaucrats. It is infrastructure geopolitics with long-term consequences. Keep an eye on Pakistan, Iran, and the Central Asian states. These are the most relevant adoption indicators outside of China and Russia. Third, the actual progress of the American M-code rollout. The Pentagon has published deployment targets, the effective pace of receiver upgrades across the U.S., precision arsenal JDAMs, Tomahawks, drones, is a critical indicator of whether the window of vulnerability will close before the threat reaches full operational maturity. Fourth, the frequency and sophistication of documented GPS spoofing incidents. Every new episode recorded in conflict zones or near U.S. military assets is a data point for a doctrine in active development. Adversaries aren't just building alternative systems, they are actively testing and refining their ability to degrade American GPS as a regular operational practice, gathering data that will inform tactics in a real conflict. Fifth, U.S. investments in PNT alternatives, positioning, navigation, and timing. Especially the revival of discussions around ELRAN as a terrestrial backup and inertial navigation upgrade programs for high-priority military systems. If the Pentagon is investing seriously in these alternatives, it's because the internal recognition of structural vulnerability has already happened. Follow the defense budget in these specific line items. Here is the big picture. GPS isn't dead. GPS remains functional, accurate, and widely used by billions of devices and systems around the world. But its monopoly has been broken, and with it, the strategic premise upon which 30 years of American military doctrine was built. GPS was the invisible foundation upon which American precision power rested. Missiles that hit specific building windows from hundreds of miles away. Drones operating in coordinated swarms across vast theaters of operation. Carrier strike groups projecting precise force thousands of miles from any permanent base. All these capabilities exist because there was a reliable, exclusive coordinate system that adversaries couldn't replicate at scale. That exclusivity no longer exists. The question that will define the next phase of this story is precise. In the next high-intensity conflict, whether in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or any theater where the United States projects force against adversaries who have built alternative infrastructure to GPS, which coordinate system will the battlefield depend on? The system the Americans control, and which adversaries have learned to degrade with increasing sophistication, or the system the adversaries control, over which Washington has no operational influence at all. This is the true meaning of the constellation orbiting above you right now, 300 miles up, in silence, in every direction, and across every battlefield of the century that is just beginning. Keep watching, stay informed, because this story is nowhere near its end.